Hello, everyone. How's it going? I'm Mystery.
I'm Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we are the Duality of Man. This is going to be a controversial one, I have a feeling, because there's this habit in modern day academia where they insist on making witch trials historically a woman's issue. And there's also a habit in academia that leads to basically the entire concept of witchcraft being earmarked as entirely a woman's issue and or feminist construct. And as a practicing occultist with 16 years of fucking experience, who is also a history nerd, um, it's just thoroughly wrong and infuriating on both counts. Because the thing of it is, no matter what the modern day deconstructionalist will tell you, witch trials were not a woman's issue. And nor is the co opting of the entirety of witchcraft as a whole as a feminist concept anywhere near legitimate. But
I think
one thing at a time.
I think that a lot of modern feminists have been drawn to witchcraft, um, particularly because of the witch trials. They seem to prefer the oppressor oppressed narrative with the patriarchal Christian society and the poor put upon women.
Uh huh. And without further ado, I guess we should get into some history sporging because I do love me some history sporging, particularly around occult topics. Um, to begin with, the ratios of victims of witch trials is roughly about 60-40 for the majority of medieval history. Only towards the end of the Burning Times, which is the historical time where witch trials were probably the most pervasive and common, did it switch to being more close to about 70-30. But even then, that is about how it averaged out. It started as being a 60-40 ratio, and it ended up somewhere in the vicinity of a 70-30 ratio. But at no point was there ever a time where no men were victims of the witch trials. The as I was saying, the ratio for the most part stands at 60-40, and only towards the tail end did it get lopsided again, or more lopsided and become about 70-30. Because the gender of the person, and thereby the gendered victimhood hive mind, had nothing whatsoever to do with the rationale behind witch trials. Nothing. In the mind of the people that were actually committing the witch trials, and I do think we should actually address the way these people thought so as to actually address the reasons why they did things and their own personal motivations for doing things. In the minds of medieval Christians, witchcraft was essentially considered to be an extension of the sin of lust. That is a large part of why women were more often, and again pointing out only slightly more often, accused of witchcraft than men. Because according to the quintessential witchcraft stopping manual of the time, the Malleus Maleficarum, written by Jacob Springer and Heinrich Kramer, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, unquote. For context of that, let me explain that in the medieval Christian mind, witchcraft specifically, not all magic, which is another issue, we often think today that anyone who was thought to practice magic was by definition a witch, and that's the end of it. But at the very least, in the Christian mindset, witchcraft referred specifically to sex magic that usually also involved some form of pact with usually a demon, although not always a demon. And we'll get into that more as well. But point being, the reason why women were more often accused of witchcraft was for two reasons. Number one, because their generative instinct was seen as stronger than men's because they actually carried the children. And witchcraft was essentially the misuse of your sexual generative impulse in the Christian mind. And two, because women were thought to be more innocent than men, and therefore more prone to trickery or corruption by the devil. In short, the reason why more women were victimized by witch trials, and again, statistically not that many more, was because women were seen as more powerful than men sexually, and more pure than men morally. Therefore, they were held to a higher standard of how they used their sexual generative impulse. And also, they were considered more pure, therefore more susceptible to trickery. And you can see this in many, many journals and official trial documents of witch trials. But you can also see it linguistically in the term warlock, which is the term that was most often applied to a man who was said to deed his soul to the devil and use his sexual generative impulse for the crime of witchcraft. Which means in old Anglo-Saxon, the word warlock comes from a word meaning oath breaker or traitor. The reason being is because in the medieval Christian mindset, Christians were said to have a covenant with God. They were said to have an official covenant with God, and any betrayal of that covenant was breaking an oath to God. I bring this up because in trials of women, in witch trials where the victims were women, the reason that the women were being persecuted, according to the people doing the persecuting, was to punish them in this life so as to save their soul and sanctify it for the next life, so women could still go to heaven after the ordeals they go through during the witch trials. But when men were thought to do the exact same thing as the women were said to do, they were called warlock, oathbreaker, traitor, because when women were thought to sign their souls over to the devil, the assumption was by default, oh, she must have been tricked, oh, the devil must have gotten to her, oh, he turned her own sexuality against her, she is a victim, therefore we must save her soul. But when men were accused of the exact same goddamn thing, he was obviously agentive in this decision and made an active choice to betray his oath to God, hence warlock. And do you now see why I have a hard time with the notion that witch trials were a woman's issue?
I mean,
Because woman sells her soul to the devil allegedly, and she is a victim of the devil's treachery. Man alleged to sell his soul, did it on purpose and was fully cognizant of doing so, according to the official narrative.
also, from things that I've read about the time period, wasn't it women who were one of the driving forces behind the hunt for witches and warlocks?
Yes, the majority of the accusers were women, and in particular in the probably most famous American witch trial, the Salem witch trials, the accusers were a gaggle of young teenage women who were victims of a brain abnormality which involved seizures, which may or may not have been the result of ergot poisoning. But also were using it as an excuse to wield social power that they otherwise wouldn't have directly had. That's why I always laugh when feminists say, "We are the descendants of the witches you didn't burn." I always giggle to myself with that because it more likely, my dear feminists, you are the descendants of the accusers of the alleged witches. Because what would very often happen is you would get uppity middle class young women or married women, depending, accusing outcast women who had done something allegedly morally wrong. Which brings to mind for me the concept of pick meism and internalized misogyny, the go to accusations of feminist women and extremely gynocentric women against anyone who doesn't fit the feminine mold, quote unquote.
Yeah, and for men, it's just basically me too.
Yeah, yeah, but that's neither here nor there. I want to get back into the particulars of the understanding of witchcraft at the time of the actual witch trials, because again, in the modern world, we have this notion that anyone who practiced magic was by definition considered to be in league with the devil, and by definition was therefore a witch. But this was not the case. There was plenty of understanding of white magic, quote unquote, in the medieval mind. And even during the Salem witch trials, several types of alleged white magic were used to attempt to counter maleficia, which was the official term used in um, legal documents for the crimes of witchcraft. It
Also,
wasn't. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to mention that as I've been reading the Three Matters, you do see magic in a lot of these stories that were created by Christians, for Christians. Like the Legend of King Arthur, his sword Excalibur is explicitly made by the Fae. He is a court wizard in Merlin, and has it's a very Christian kingdom. I mean, they send three knights to go searching for the Holy Grail. And in the matter of France, they have like a ton of swords that were made by magic, and one of their knights ends up becoming a sorcerer as well. And this is the story about the Christian Emperor Charlemagne. So, you know, it's not magic themselves that was necessarily what they considered bad, because why would Christians tell a story about their own history involving
Yeah.
magic and things when,
E- Go ahead.
yeah, when they were said to abhor it? So
Even
it's
working with demons in a medieval context wasn't always considered to be a necessarily bad thing, because the idea was, and you see this in a lot of the surviving grimoires, and by a lot I mean basically all of them. Um, the idea that a pious wizard or a pious operator is usually the term used in the grimoires, could use the power and the authority of heaven and angels to bind demons and enslave them. In particular, in the one of the copies of the Ars Goetia, known as the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, there's an entire treatise on what's known as thwarting angels, which were essentially angelic intermediaries whose whole job it was to bind and enslave demons for a magic practitioner's will. The term used in legal documents for what we now call witchcraft was specifically maleficia, or malice in English. Um, because the idea was, it wasn't that you were practicing magic, it was the source of your magic, allegedly. Because again, to define witchcraft in the most um to sort of modernize our definition of witchcraft along the lines that the people accusing people during the witch trials would have approved of, for what we would now call witchcraft, you need three, possibly four elements. You need to act through the intermediary of a pact with a non-Christian entity. And I say non-Christian entity because there were several trials where the people weren't alleged to have compacted with demons, but instead fae. Particularly in England, there were the trials known as the Trials of the Queen of Elfame, where allegedly a sect of witches had gotten their powers from a fairy queen. Now, the question of which fairy queen is another interesting matter, but that's neither here nor there. There were also several Germanic witch trials where Woden or Odin was said to be the entity being the entity facilitating the pact. The second thing you need for it to technically be witchcraft in the medieval mind is, again, it needs to be a misuse of the generative impulse in such a way that it can be seen as an extension of the sin of lust. It's essentially what would later, by people like Aleister Crowley, be referred to as sex magic. And three, you need someone to be doing these arts for personal, selfish, um, malefic reasons, otherwise known as, in the modern parlance, what we would refer to as being on the left-hand path. You can use magic for divine reasons, and it's not witchcraft. You can use magic by the intermediary of angels, and it's not witchcraft. You can even use magic in the intermediary of demons, and according to the medieval understanding of the term, it's not witchcraft as long as you're not treating the demon as a partner in a compact, but as a slave that you're operating through the authority of God to bind.
Speaking of which, I believe I read somewhere that uh, King Solomon, King of the Jews, in the Bible, didn't he have a ring that was given to him by God that he used to bind demons?
Yes, depending on the version of the story, he was either given this ring by the angel Gabriel or the angel Raziel. I personally think Raziel is more likely because Raziel's function in the angelic hierarchy is specifically as an angel of secrets and of magic. His name literally translates to um, the angel of secrets or the secrets of God. Um, the reason I dispute the Gabriel thing is Michael and Gabriel get the credit in a lot of myths when people don't know the angel in question. They're just like, yeah, we needed an angel to do this thing, and we know it was an angel, so it must have been either Gabriel or Michael. Um, that's just that's an interesting mythological or religious conversation on angelology and so on, but that's a topic for a completely different day. Um, but yeah, the thing I wanted to focus on here, because of the fact that it's always in modern parlance, even in academia, viewed as a woman's issue, is the men that were accused of maleficia or witchcraft. Um, Number one, as I said, the ratios were never as disproportional as the modern academia would have you think. Number two, um, warlocks always gained more blame than witches. I already explained how that worked, even in terms of linguistics. And number three, when men were accused of crimes relating to witchcraft, they often were accused of harsher crimes because it was thought that male sorcerers or warlocks would act as the leaders of their respective covens and would actually be somewhat responsible um, for corrupting the innocence of the women in the coven. So, in other words, when men were accused, they were accused harsher, they were accused with more blame attached, and they usually got harsher sentences. And that's not even saying anything about the actual tortures that people underwent, because even while believing these women were quote unquote harlots of the devil, women still got off easier on the torture department. Now, don't get me wrong, that does not make it okay by any stretch of the imagination. Not ever. Torture is bad, no matter how unsevere it is. But it is worth noting that women usually could make pleas for clemency or appeal to her virtue as a woman to lessen the torture. And of course, the executions that we have on record were often also more severe for male um, defendants. One of the easiest examples of this that I can come up with off the top of my head was the execution of one Giles Corey, in the Salem witch trials. Most of the witches alleged that were accused in Salem were hung, because another funny little bit of historical and legal chicanery is in most of continental Europe, witchcraft was viewed as a religious crime. It was a betrayal of God, after all, therefore it was considered basically blasphemy. But in England, especially under the reign of King James, who basically entirely brought England into the burning times. Before then, England was one of the safest places to be if you were someone following old religious practices of the pagan variety, or were a cunning woman or a cunning man. Because before the reign of King James, it was very uncommon for witch trials to occur. King James, however, was a paranoid motherfucker who was obsessed with demonology and witchcraft paranoia, and appointed several royal witch hunters. But that's neither here nor there. The interesting thing is, in England, witchcraft was viewed as a civil crime, and therefore the punishment for it was not burning, but hanging. And that also continued in the English colonies, and that's why most of the victims of the Salem witch trials were hung, and none of them were burned. But yeah, Giles, I was talking about Giles Corey. Giles Corey, as most people know, thanks to things like the Crucible, was crushed to death by stones. And he never even pled guilty or innocent. He refused to dignify the accusation, and therefore, because he refused to plead as guilty or not guilty, they did what was called pressing for an answer with giant motherfucking stones. Now, obviously, all the victims of the Salem witch trials died in the end, so it's foolish to quibble over which was worse, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say being crushed to death by stones is several orders of magnitude worse than strangulation or neck breaking by hanging, because at the very least, the neck breaking by hanging, if you hang someone correctly, is done fairly quickly, because most people don't survive a broken neck for very long. Whereas being crushed to death by stones is slow and agonizing, and your ribs are breaking from the inside out. Also, base Giles Corey for not wanting to dignify the entire circus and refusing to plead, as he's most famously thought to have said, rather than guilty or not guilty, his last words were more weight, because he was essentially mocking them and challenging them to be harder if they were going to try and press him for an answer. Base Giles Corey.
Let me ask you, like percentage wise, how many of the people do you think that died in the trials were actually witches?
Uh, it's funny because we actually do know that some of the accused did practice various kinds of folk magic, and in fact, it's sort of a funny story. Um, in the 1600s, you had a clergyman who was actually arguing for an end to the witch trials. He wrote a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, wherein he outlined the various practices of alleged witches that had actually confessed to practicing things. And his book became increasingly popular, but it became popular with people who wanted to do witchcraft, to the point that there was a second edition, an edition in 1666, that was published with footnotes of magical practitioners of the time, basically explaining, well, I experimented with this spell and I modified it in this way and it seemed to work better. And for the longest time, we didn't actually have access to the 1666 copy of the Discovery of Witchcraft with the various elucidations in it, because in the 1950s, a copy of the Discovery of Witchcraft was published without the extraneous footnotes of actual practitioners, but also without the actual technical know-how of the person who originally wrote the Discovery of Witchcraft, whose name escapes me, or else I would have said it. Um, but so we do know there were people who engaged in various folk practices, various forms of village shamanism, various forms of folk magic, that could reasonably be called witches by most standards, although we're fairly certain none of them were witches by the medieval definition, i.e., no pacts, no sex magic, and um, no maleficia. Um, but we do know some people that were accused were midwives, wise women, and cunning folk. That being
Maybe,
said, the
maybe some
ratio
herbalists too.
the ratio of people who were alleged to practice anything that could be called magic, was actually fairly small. Most people that were accused were just the poor village beggar, or the person with a family legacy of land that other people in the village prized or whatever. To, and
Also,
it's funny to me because in medieval grimoires of the time, there were actually spells to keep the clergy off your back. There were spells that were entitled something along the lines of, to win the favor of clergymen and the priesthood, which was essentially a get the authorities off your back spell. And I find that funny because so many of the accused were not even tangentially related to
yeah.
practicing magic.
To put it in video game terms, a reduce aggro spell.
Yeah, it's like I need to get in good with the police so they don't come knocking on my door spell, basically.
Also, do you think there were any charlatans who were accused basically, like say someone wants to, put a curse on someone or buy like a love potion or something. So somebody, fakes being like a witch or something just for like money, and then
I
people find out and they get accused.
I mean, we do know we do know that happens. We also know that many of such cases occurred after someone went to them for um various, you know, cures or advices or spells. So in other words, uh, being accused of a witch if you were a charlatan was basically the most angry possible Yelp review. I went for a spell and it didn't work, so now I'm going to accuse you of maleficia because reasons. That's basically. I was fine with using your powers when I thought they actually worked, but you gave me a uh, cheap knockoff spell and it didn't work. So guess who's getting accused of witchcraft now, sir? It's very funny when you actually look at I mean obviously there was straight up irrational hysteria going on where people were paranoid about anything they didn't understand. That is definitely a thing. But it's interesting when you consider how many people in the Middle Ages actually tried to practice various forms of magic. Um, Both because a large percentage of them managed to do so without ever being accused, and also because a large percentage of the people who got accused were people who were otherwise perfectly respectable, cunning folk or wise women, or were thought to be, and then people accused them after going to them for help and not getting the help they wanted. It's funny how that works. It's not as simple as everyone lost their minds one day and believed there was witches and therefore was, you know, it was a travesty. It's a lot more complicated when you consider some people actually aspired to be witches and some people actually were other forms of magical practitioner and were essentially got by either their competition, which was also something that happened. One village wise woman or one cunning man would accuse one of his rivals or her rivals of malefic witchcraft, and then whoops, now there's only one village wise woman. Isn't it funny how that works?
Didn't the French court have Nostradamus in their midst specifically because he could see the future?
They did, and of course, Queen Elizabeth had John Dee as not only her court astrologer and magician, but also her court spy master. In fact, some of the earliest English excursions to America were planned and executed by John Dee and his agents. It's kind of funny how the guy who's probably the most famous in occult circles for having lengthy conversations with angels was also basically the Elizabethan equivalent of James Bond, to the point that his spy designation number was literally 007.
Wow. How did he drink his alcohol?
I this was before the modern notion of the cocktail, but if time travel ever becomes popular, I want to go back and offer him a martini just to see what happens. I want that to be a thing. I very much want that to be a thing. But I don't know.
These were deeply Christian nations, especially given the times.
Mm-hmm. And for the most part, their magic, for there was a lot of it, was also very heavily Christian influenced. I mean, most of the surviving grimoires we have were grimoires that were copied by monks during the Middle Ages, and were later printed when the printing press became available. For example, the Ars Goetia was something that we know several clergymen had in their personal libraries, and we also have evidence that they actually used it. The Munich Necromancer's Manual, same thing, was likely written by either a monk or a clergyman of some description. There was actually quite a lot of people in the clergy, particularly in the Catholic clergy, who made a habit of using magic and necromancy specifically. There are several books. One of the most recent ones that I had the pleasure of having access to was a book called Necromancy in the Medici Library, that was likely written by several clergymen over the course of about 100 years.
Was that in Florence?
Yes. And also actually in the Medici Library of France as well, because for those that don't know, Catherine de' Medici was the Queen of France for several decades and was also the main patroness of Nostradamus. We don't actually know, though, how closely related the Medicis of Florence were and the Medicis of France, but we know they were distant cousins of some description.
Yeah, European royalty is like an interwoven web.
I mean, do we even need to talk about the Habsburg and just how many dynasties are rooted somewhere in a bastardization of the Habsburg line? But yeah, that's another interesting aspect of witchcraft of the time, is that or magic of the time. Many of the clergy engaged in magic fairly regularly, and most of the surviving grimoires we have are Christian in nature. They use the authority of God as an intermediary for their spells. And again, there's the whole thing about spells to bind demons using thwarting angels and that. Although, again, fascinatingly, most of them never became accused. Again, funny how there were spells for get the clergy off my back.
Let me ask you, how did these hunts and trials come to an end?
Usually, when a person above the station of the people doing the accusing was accused. Um, in Salem, it was when the governor's wife was accused. In Germany, I believe it was when one of the duchesses was accused. Um, there were several cases where priests got accused, and then all of a sudden the witch trials got hushed up. Um, it's it's an almost infallible rule of thumb that if you want a witch trial to end, you simply have to accuse someone above your station, and then they will end. It
Money
is,
really is power.
yeah, it's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the goddamn same. And I'm not even sure how much money had much to do with it. I think it was mostly, as it is now, clout that was the issue. It was the idea of you don't accuse the aristocracy. In fact, one of the most commonly accused sets of people was the emerging merchant class of the time, i.e., people who weren't owed aristocratic money but had managed to, by way of business, accrue a significant holding. Your agricultural barons, your merchant travelers, etc. I believe Giles Corey was one of those. He actually had one of the largest farms in the New World at the time of being accused, uh, and then of course, someone wanted to get him out of the way, and the rest is under the stones.
I mean, they say it's the nail that sticks out that gets the hammer.
Hmm. It is funny though. If you actually look at the transcripts of a lot of witch trials, for as much as I'm kind of treating most of the things I've explained to you as new information that we've recently discovered, there were several cases where someone got accused of witchcraft and got out of it by explaining that what they were doing was white magic and not black magic. Like there was a rather famous example of someone being accused of werewolfism because in the Middle Ages and early modern period, werewolfism was actually considered to be a specialty of witchcraft, i.e., it was sort of a subdivision of witchcraft. Vampirism was kind of the same way. Although to be fair, more men were accused of werewolfism and vampirism than were accused of witchcraft. So even that could be somewhat used to account for the disparity between witchcraft accusations. Women were accused more often of witchcraft specifically, but um, men were more often accused of things like werewolfism and vampirism, possibly because werewolfism and vampirism were more quote unquote masculine forms of magic, allegedly. But I was getting back to the way someone got out of a werewolfism accusation. There was a case in England where someone was accused of werewolfism, and the way he got out of it, this is kind of amazing. He confessed to shapeshifting into a wolf. He straight up confessed to it. But what he said was he was he was shapeshifting into a wolf by the means of the authority of God because he was a member of a sect of werewolves that operated under divine authority and went into the realms of hell specifically to fight demons. They were referred to as the Hounds of God because apparently holy werewolves may have been a thing, at the very least in this person's mind.
Someone's got to make that into a movie.
It truly is one of the most badass things I've ever fucking heard, and to his credit, the man got off. Like he came correct and was like, "Oh no, I see. I've done some things that could, on the outside, look like witchcraft, but actually, I'm a secret uh, version of Heaven's Commandos, and we change into wolves and then go into hell and beat up demons." Again, accused person, or actually no, I think that might have been in Germany, not England, but regardless, it definitely happened. Look up the Hounds of God. It's a thing that happened in the course of the witch trials, and I love it so fucking much.
Yeah, I just realized there was actually a reference to that in the TV show Penny Dreadful.
Oh, the Hounds of God.
Yeah, that's what the main character is referred to by by I think Dracula,
Uh-huh. Which
because the main
that
character
wouldn't
ends up.
surprise me. I'm not familiar with. I never watched Penny Dreadful, despite the fact that it does seem like a show I would have liked. I just never got around to it. But
It's pretty good.
I'm glad that somebody used the Hounds of God. Me and my friend the Brainstormer of Pop Culture are actually planning on using the Hounds of God as part of our comic that we're doing as well. But yeah, the Hounds of God, probably the most original way of getting out of a witch trial accusation. Yeah, I transformed into a wolf, but I was doing it under divine authority, and it worked. So I can't knock it. Which I don't know if that guy was just insane or not, but I'm tempted to believe that he was actually telling the truth because that is one of those things that surely he must have been using some magic because I don't think there's a way anyone who wasn't using magic could have gotten out of that using that excuse.
Yeah, it's like that is so crazy. I'm tempted to believe it.
Like I don't know if the House of God are a thing, but it 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 makes sense, so I'm gonna go with it.
Just use
Um,
just the X Files line. I want to believe.
yeah, it like even speaking myself as a practicing occultist with more than 16 years of experience, I'm tempted to just go, you wouldn't happen to have written any of those spells down, would you? Because I want to read that grimoire. I someone find and make a translation of the Grimoire of the Hounds of God. If that ever gets found, I don't care. It can be $100 book. I'm still buying it at some point. Um, seriously. Where are the academic translators at? Where are Joseph Peterson and Stephen Skinner right now? They need to be searching for the Grimoire of the House of God. But yeah, that's a we got sidetracked. But that is another way of looking at the witch trial accusation gender slant. Yeah, it's slightly slanted in the woman's, for lack of a better word, favor. Although obviously she was being accused of a thing. Um, with regards to witchcraft specifically, but if you throw in vampirism trials and werewolfism trials, both of which were considered to be specialized subdivisions of witchcraft, that gender slant not only gets annihilated, but it gets inverted because, of course, men were also frequently accused of straight up witchcraft. And then when you consider how disproportional the werewolfism accusation was and or the vampirism accusation was, it almost goes the opposite direction. But one of those things you never fucking hear in feminist or academic modern diatribes about the witch trials.
So tell me about the vampires, because even in today's modern era, there are people who go super into like pre- pretending to or trying to live like vampires.
Yep, and there's even in the modern occult community, there is a specialized form of magic that is styled after the vampire. It's occasionally referred to as psychic vampirism because the idea of the vampire is more about um, stealing life energy from people rather than actually being what's known as a sanguinary vampire. Although there are plenty of people who are alleged to do who strive to do both, i.e., there are people who choose to drink blood who also um, exercise vampiric magic as part of their spirituality. It's 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 very interesting, and I'd be lying if I didn't think that people like Anne Rice and Stephanie Meyer repopularizing the iconography of the vampire didn't have something to do with it. But then again,
Yeah.
a
I'm
lot of
assuming
people,
down Sparkle though.
a lot of people get into a lot of people get into occultism after either studying mythology or studying religion or studying or just liking a particular fantasy series. No, that doesn't mean that Harry Potter will turn your kids into Satanists, tradcon evangelicals, but it does mean that many of modern practitioners, I'm sure, were inspired by people like um, Harry Dresden, Doctor Strange, etc. And those of us that were practitioners regardless can still look to well written fantasy and take inspiration. In fact, I know at least one book by a lot of practitioners that I respect. It's a book called Ritual Offerings. I think the main author on it is a guy by the name of Aaron Leach. But there's a section in there. It's a conglomeration of essays on various different kinds of spirits and various different kinds of offering. But there's a section in there that's specifically about how to summon up and feed a familiar and bind it to a skull. And I was reading this and of course thinking of Bob from the Dresden Files, because how could I not? And then as sure as I am fucking sitting here, the author also made a reference to Bob from the Dresden Files, and I was just like, this is the best thing ever. I love when it turns out magical practitioners are also fucking nerds, because it's like, yay, I'm not the only one who takes inspiration from things. And then again, why not? I mean, we there are many examples of scientists doing the exact same thing. Like, I mean, the whole reason the flip phone existed and the first cell phones were flip phones was because somebody wanted to make a Star Trek communicator. Um, there are people now who basically managed to make um, early proto lightsabers out of a blowtorch.
Yeah,
Um,
plasma cutters and
yeah. Um, And what's funny about that, this is a complete sidebar, but what's funny about that is if you look into the Star Wars lore, the very first lightsabers were said to have power packs that were either held on the side of someone's body or held on their back like a backpack. And if you
yeah.
look at the modern day sort of proto lightsabers, they also are essentially connected to a power pack.
The only thing that's missing is a better battery.
Fuck yeah, fucking funny how that works. But back on point. If you can take concepts from science fiction and through a thorough enough understanding of science transpose them into some form of reality, I see nothing wrong with people who are magical practitioners looking at fantasy series, especially the particularly well written ones, like Dresden Files, and going, "Can I use that? Because I'm tempted to use that because I use Dresden Files as an example specifically because Dresden Files is an awesome example of how you write um, magic in a fantasy setting properly in such a way that people who are practitioners can actually take inspiration from it. Harry Potter is one of the worst. No one has ever been converted into any occult practice by way of Harry Potter. Um,
As someone who read all the books, I can confirm this.
because it's just a terrible magic system insofar as it's not even a magic system. But I guess that's as good a transition as any to talk about kind of the modern day witches, quote unquote.
Just
Um,
regarding people getting into magic in response to fantasy, there's a quote from Tolkien that I believe is applicable here, and I believe he was talking to C.S. Lewis at the time when he said this is that people can read stories from the modern world and it entertains them, but when they put it down, they just go right back to the drudgery of the real world. But when people read things like fantasy, it stays with them and they get absorbed into that world because they feel like this isn't the way the world is, but it's the way the world should be, and that
Yeah,
it speaks to some underlying truth of the world that we're simply unable to see.
yeah. And again, if you want a more secularized version of that, look at books like The Physics of Superheroes or The Physics of Star Trek, where they literally go into, based on what we know of physics, this is how this would work. Well, there's no reason why you couldn't do that in a magical context, and take something like the Dresden Files and take inspiration from it. And as I just went over, many practitioners, up to and including but not limited to myself, have. Anyway, but we got off to the side again. Another aspect of um, witchcraft as it relates to men's issues that I wanted to touch on at least briefly here is the way that not only is the history of things like witch trials politicized, or used as an ideological construct in feminist narratives, but the idea of witchcraft as a whole is very often considered to be specifically a feminine power, um, to the point that many fluffy bunny new age Wiccan types tried to put curses on Trump while he was in office. Fortunately, they also, in my opinion, as a practitioner with many years of experience and many different philosophies and or religions as background, they're not good at they weren't good at this particular task. So it's good news. But that's neither here nor there. I wanted to talk about specifically in things like Wicca and the New Age movement, how feminism has become almost inseparable from a lot of hipsters and hippies' understanding of magic and witchcraft. Um, and it's funny because a lot of people seem to think that the movement of Wicca is actually old, which it isn't. It was made in the late 19th and early 20th century by a guy by the name of Gerald Gardner, who, by his own admission, was a male feminist, and he wanted to create a spirituality that allowed for the exploration of sexuality, specifically feminine sexuality. Um, he got the idea from an academic work from the 19th century known broadly as the witch cult hypothesis, which was the idea that this is sort of the patient zero for the bastardization of witchcraft history by way of feminism. The idea that the witch trials were specifically about um, stifling a a female centric pagan cult, and we didn't. Gerald Gardner didn't have much evidence of this, for there is simply not much evidence of it. Period. But he essentially wanted to take the idea, mix it together with English folk magic, combine it with his feminist ideology, and create an excuse for um, women to get naked and have orgies around him, more or less.
This guy just wanted to get laid, didn't he?
Yep, he wanted to create a female-centric cult, so he had an excuse to basically. He wanted to combine religion and male feminism, and Wicca was basically the result.
I
What
mean,
what
it's a
what?
hell of an idea.
I mean, it worked. I can't fault him for it not working. It worked. It worked well into the 60s and 70s during the like new age boom of the 60s. So meh. But at the same time, there's almost no historical backing for any of the bullshit that he came up with, and it heavily conflated feminist ideologies and um the notion of magic and or witchcraft. Um, and what's funny is most modern day Wiccans don't even practice it in a way that he would have approved of, because even the dick-brained male feminist that was Gerald Gardner made some space for the importance of the masculine energy. For those that don't know, doctrinally, Wicca is supposed to have two main deities, a goddess and a god, or a lord and a lady. But most modern day Wiccans, especially the feminist aligned ones, completely forego any semblance of masculinity, male deities, or the male archetype, and instead focus primarily on um, the idea of the goddess. And quite a lot of Wiccans and New Age types don't even view the goddess as a goddess. They view the goddess as essentially a Jungian archetype of the feminine, specifically the famous 3-in-1 mother, maiden, and crone archetype. What I find funny is even playing the ball where it lies there, which I have no reason to do, but even playing the ball where it lies, to be intellectually honest, they feminists don't really even uh, um, embody the tripartite feminine aspect of the mother, maiden, and crone, because they're not, they want the power of the maiden, but they don't value purity or the abstaining of sexuality. So that checks off the maiden box. Um, feminists very rarely, if ever, want to be mothers, and even if they are mothers, they in aren't nurturing, healing, or hearth and home based like the mother archetype is said to be. So that takes care of the power of the mother.
Don't they
And
view motherhood as like oppressive?
yes, they view motherhood as oppressive, and yet simultaneously want a very gynocentric, very feminine form of quasi pagan spirituality that they call witchcraft that revolves around the mother, maiden, and crone. So in other words, they want the power of the maiden, but they don't value virginity or purity or innocence. They want the power of the mother, but they don't value nurturing, healing, caregiving, or motherhood. And they want the power of the crone, but they don't want. Um, they often have very, very big issues with aging, and they never really prioritize wisdom at all. So my question for feminists, apart from the get your politics out of my spirituality and get your politics out of magic because it doesn't belong there, because because I believe that magic actually exists and that witchcraft actually exists, I view it as manipulating the fundamental forces of nature. And one thing that I feel it's important to do when manipulating the fundamental forces of nature is to not bias them like a motherfucker. And yet these people choose to use magic as a political tool in the abstract. In fact, I'm fairly certain most of them don't even believe in it. They just use it as a political statement, basically, which I find to be insulting. Again, I have 16 years of practice of general occultism, which I've studied various different kinds of magic. I've studied Wicca, I've studied the New Age stuff, I've studied Renaissance magic, as I've gone into in quite a lot of detail here. I've studied the history of the witch trials, as I've also gone into quite a lot of detail here. I've gone into Hermeticism and Greco-Roman and Egyptian magic. I've gone into um, the magic of the Middle Ages or of the Middle East, which would have included places like Sumeria, Babylon, Canaan, and of course what would eventually become Judea. I've studied Islamic Sahir. I've studied Judeo-Christian magic. I've studied Kabbalah. I've been all over the shop. I've done my academic due diligence with regards to magic, and I really really hate the idea that it's basically just a Jungian pantomime for some feminists to stick it to the patriarchy, quote unquote, um, which just is we've gone into why the patriarchy is bullshit. I don't need to belabor that point. But yes, the very concept of women being oppressed as as a class or as a gender is bullshit, and the idea of a patriarchy is bullshit, at least in the feminist definition of patriarchy. anthropologically, you can almost get away with it half the time, but even anthropologists, I feel, often get away with that by ignoring the uh, covert power that women have always held for domesticity, hearth and home, and manipulation.
I mean, anthropologically, you could say that if patriarchy existed, it's because men were the ones who were in charge of security, of making sure that the women and the children were safe, up to and including going out and fighting and dying.
Yeah. But who did these men and their patriarchal structures almost always work for, but also directly answering to? The answer is women and children. I mean, it's become a cliche to point this out, but the line is women and children first, which leaves who to be last again. And also, point of order: how often does childhood last for women versus how long does childhood last for men? Because for most of what we know as modern history, um, children's privilege for men ended anywhere from 13 to 18, i.e., if you were able-bodied enough young man, you got classed with the idea of men, and therefore it was your job to help in such extreme circumstances. Whereas if you were a young woman, children's privilege lasted for you right up until the point where you got married, basically. Um,
Or you reach marrying age.
yeah, at which point it was somewhat your responsibility to be responsible for courting, but usually even courting was filtered through the uh, the officiating power of the father, in which case someone had to get through the father to even be able to talk to the daughter.
Yes, the whole meeting the new boyfriend and scaring the living crap out of him tradition.
Yeah, it's not new, and it's not something that Texans came up with. Although I'm sure Texans will disagree with me on that because Texans like take credit for things. But yeah, it's not something that Americans came up with. I think Americans, as we do with most things, took the basic idea that other cultures had and fucking made it a nuclear grade version of it. But what else is new? But back on point to the idea of feminists wanting to utilize the idea of witch imagery without actually living up to the witch imagery. It's also worth noting that I'm pretty sure that everyone who even has a passing familiarity with witchcraft or witchcraft-based fantasy knows about the mother maiden crone archetype, the 3-in-1, the tripartite feminine. How many people even know what the male equivalent would be? Because I've tried to guess what the male equivalent would be for the mother maiden and crone. And honestly, I am not sure what intuitively makes sense as a counterpart to the mother maiden and crone. I'm tempted to go back to the Middle Age guild system and say apprentice, journeyman, master, but that leaves out quite a few male archetypes. You could say warrior, chieftain, sage, or maybe squire, knight, lord. That might work. But my point is that we almost intuitively at this point, when we think of the three virtues or the three faces of femininity, even someone who only has a passing familiarity with it would just automatically spew mother, maiden, and crone. But you ask what the male equivalent of that is, what the tripartite masculine identities would be, and you'd get bickering. You'd get some people arguing for the guild system, apprentice, journeyman, master. You'd get some people arguing for like the Middle Ages version of squire, knight, king, or squire, knight, lord. And you get some people saying warrior, father, sage, or warrior, chieftain, sage, or perhaps squire, king, wizard would be another one. But it's not nearly as inarguable or not nearly as intuitive. The other thing about the mother, maiden, and crone archetype that's worth noting in relation to how witchcraft got feminized is most of the triple goddess mythology we have, while there is some basis to it, there's always been triple goddesses. The idea of it being associated specifically with um, sexuality comes from a book entitled The White Goddess, which I believe came out in the early 20th century. Um, and it was it wasn't a historically based um, it wasn't in any way a historically based piece of anthropology. What it was essentially feminist fanfic, feminist fanfic that conflated all the various triple goddesses into one singular white goddess, quote unquote. And we have evidence that suggests, and I think in some places the author of this book even admits to it, that he based his theory about the divine feminine or the white goddess off of an ex that he had, and he was trying to get over his relationship with her ending badly by making her the face of his white goddess archetype.
Simp.
Yeah, he was simping by way of bastardized feminist anthropology.
But one thing that just occurred to me is that a lot of these people who like in like medieval times or like the colonial period
Mm-hmm.
who started practicing magic, how many of them do you think started it because they were explicitly told not to?
Again, one of the greatest surges of this happened when a guy wrote a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, basically trying to itemize things that he felt didn't work, and then a bunch of women and or men uh, grabbed that book and went, "This is a step-by-step instruction manual on how to be a witch. I'm going to try it." And then it became so popular that, again, there was a later edition in 1666 published that had essentially field notes of, I tried this and I modified it slightly in this way and it worked better, basically.
I swear, it's like my niece. I tell her, don't feed your food to the dog. The second I turn my back, I know what she's gonna do.
She's doing it more now just to spite you.
She's 2. I think she does it more because she thinks it's fun.
I don't know. Maybe your niece is developed for her age and has figured out the concept of spite.
I don't think so. She seems too happy to be spiteful.
Maybe. But reverse psychology be how reverse psychology be. And again, it's funny that one of the most thorough manuals on witchcraft that we have was specifically a book trying to debunk witchcraft. Um, and to the credit of the guy who wrote The Discovery of Witchcraft, the original version that actually had the how-to aspects to it, he was doing proper, I guess what you could call proper journalism. He wasn't trying to straw man what witches did. He actually did his homework, tried to figure out what witches actually did, and then itemized it, and then made the argument of, and here's why either you shouldn't do this or why it doesn't make sense. Because some of the earliest witchcraft skeptical books were from clergy who were basically like, yeah, yeah, witchcraft might theoretically be a problem, but but according to my religion, there's no reason why it should work, and therefore we as the enlightened Christians shouldn't pay attention to witchcraft, not because it's sinful, but because it's stupid. Of course, those very same people, to their credit, also did do proper quote unquote journalism and itemized what witchcraft did, and thereby single-handedly kind of preserved witchcraft.
You know, you also have to consider
But
that.
better that than the straw man. We're not going to interview any of these people, but we're just going to tell you what we think they think approach of modern journalists.
You also have to consider that in an extremely strict and uh, morally rigid society, that teenagers, young people, or and just people are going to rebel in any way they can. Like in like the 80s and 60s, it was like punk rock, dye your
Yeah,
hair.
repression is never good for psychology,
Yeah,
especially among teenagers whose whole thing is testing boundaries. That's part of how they individuate psychologically. So of course they're going to test boundaries. And again, it's worth noting that in a lot of cases, and particularly in the case of the Salem witch trials, the people doing the accusing were teenage aged women who otherwise wouldn't have been listened to.
yeah. So it's God. You
And of
think
course,
even you think even back
the
then they would
majority of
know you do not listening to the insane ramblings of a teenage girl.
yeah, and of course, on the other side of this, relating it to modern times and how little things actually change, most alleged witch hunters were heavily educated. For example, Cotton Mather was a graduate of Harvard. Jacob Springer and Heinrich Kramer were graduates of Oxford, I believe. Or was it Oxford? Okay, it was whichever one of those was old enough to actually support them. But regardless, a lot of the most famous witch hunters were academics. And again, I must point out, um, what was the stigma of being a witch like in the Middle Ages, and what is the stigma of being a woman with internalized misogyny or pick me status now? The more things change, the more they say the absolute fucking. I mean, think of how modern day academics view people like the Honey Badgers over at Honey Badger Radio, and how the academics of the Middle Ages would have viewed a witch. There are parallels that I find completely and utterly unavoidable here.
You want to talk about parallels? I think that if you're going to compare anybody to the modern day warlock, it'd probably be the incels.
I mean, yeah, or the toxic fandom. I mean, hell, there are entire movements that basically um, view men as inferior magical practitioners because of the whole feminism trying to co-opt witchcraft thing, and yeah, no thanks for that, but fuck off. Um, so yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the fucking same. Or actually, there's a really good medieval example that makes me think a lot of Johnny Depp because there was a famous case of possession alleged in the Middle Ages where an entire convent worth of women um, displayed possession symptoms, and they all accused a priest um, that they had been interacting with of being the one that spelled them. And most of the reasoning behind them uh, was essentially that they found this man attractive and they assumed he had bewitched them. I forget the name of the actual priest. I know the main nun that accused him was a woman by the name of Sister Jeanne. This happened in France, I do believe. She was the mother superior of a convent of uh, nuns, and she was having sexual dreams and sexual fantasies about this priest before the possession symptoms started. And so naturally, after the exorcism of this entire convent, because there was a mass exorcism where every member of this convent was exorcised. after this exorcism, they found this man whose, again, name I don't remember, but Google the possession of Sister Jean, and I'm sure his name will come up. Um, he was then tried for witchcraft and burned at the stake, as you do.
Just imagine the trial. No, so sexy it must be magic.
But again, think about what happened after the Johnny Depp verdict came in. How many articles were, oh, women have internalized misogyny because they find Johnny Depp so attractive, or Johnny Depp has this unusual vampiric-like quality that makes people want to please him, and so on. It's literally the same shit.
Really, the fame and the money don't factor into it at all.
Well, I mean, I'm sure the fame and the money did, but according to these feminist articles I read, a bunch of them were like, Johnny Depp has this unusual animal magnetism that makes people want to please him, and that's why he totally got away with that thing he was accused of, even though he was found innocent of the thing he was accused of.
I think it's a more combination of he just seems to be a very likable guy, and also those accusations were bullshit.
Yeah, in a sane world, yes, but yeah. There was also a movie based on the case of uh, Sister Jean called The Devils. It was a art house porn movie from the 70s.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna look
And
that up.
the priest was played by Oliver Reed. I still can't remember the name of the priest, but I can remember who played him in the movie. That is sad to me, but yeah, Oliver Reed was the guy who played him in the movie.
All right, we've been at this for an hour and 16 minutes. Do you have any final words regarding the?
The short version is witch trials were not a woman's issue; they were a human issue. They were motivated mostly by religious dogma and the understanding of sexuality and or magic at the time, and they were something that affected all people, regardless of gender, demographic, or otherwise. Um, and also, modern day feminists who want to co opt witchcraft as though it's their own thing and no one else has a right to it, you are attempting to politicize and use as a political weapon the fundamental forces of the universe. And as someone who definitely believes in them, you can fuck off. We have been the duality of man.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers, guys.